Right. So we have this man and woman who have made this video, and the intention, as they say at the start of the video, is to see the validity of antinatalism with with a background intention of proving invalidity of antinatalism. So let us see what arguments they have used to examine validity of antinatalism, and for which they have reached the conclusion that antinatalism is invalid. First point is that the man in that conversation criticizes the premises on which Benatar's asymmetry is based, specifically premise number 3 and premise number 1. So the third premise is that absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone. And what he says is that this is absurd claim, because if the good is not enjoyed by anyone, how can that be good? There can't be good floating around in the universe, as he says. So this is absurd claim. Now, Benatar in the book very clearly elaborates on this point, and he explains what he means by absence of pain is good even if good is not enjoyed by anyone. I'm going to read a few sentences out of that book. So first thing is that claim 3, which is this assumption, this premise, says that this absence is good when judged in terms of interests of a person who would otherwise have existed. We may not know who that person would have been, but we still say that whoever that person would have been, avoidance of his or her pain is good when judged in terms of his or her potential interests. If there is any obviously loose sense in which the absent pain is good for the person who could have existed but does not exist, it is this. Clearly, the claim does not entail the absurd literal claim that there is some actual person whom the absent pain is good. So he has quite elaborately explained what he means by that. And I have made a video explaining this, but I'll explain it again. And the point here is that if you this is about prospective comparison, this is in context of prospective comparison. So if you deny that absence of pain is good, even if someone is not there to experience that good, it leads to your classical problem of identity, non-identity problem. And what that is that we can take a thought experiment. There is a woman who wants to get pregnant, but she has a genetic defect, and all her eggs have that genetic defect in them. And the result of this is that if she gets pregnant and if she has a child, that child is going to suffer some very serious genetic disease. There is a solution to that there is a pill available, a small medication. If she takes that before she gets pregnant, it will rectify the genetic problem in her eggs and a healthy child would be born. Now, any rational person would take that medication before he or she gets pregnant. Let us see what happens in this. In taking the medication and in modifying the genetic code, what you are essentially doing, or what that woman is essentially doing, is bringing into existence a completely different child, because the genetic code was modified. So the unhealthy child which would have born had she not taken the medication would be a completely different child, completely different person, and because she took the medication, she avoided existence of that child altogether. And the reason to think this as good is because the suffering of that child has been avoided, even though that child has not come into existence. If we don't treat this good, then we have this non-identity problem. So yeah, and there are so many examples. Like you can take financial example I've taken in my previous videos. That if you do family planning and wait until you have good financial stability and then have a child instead of having a child before that, you are essentially denying existence to a certain child. and it is good in even for that child, because that child is not going to suffer even though that child never came into existence. And in this context, this premise holds. It is about absence of pain. It is not about good lying around, and it is good even though there is no one to enjoy that good. So your rebuttal on that premise is completely invalid. Then the next point he makes is pain is bad. That's the premise Benatar uses. And he says that you can't say pain is bad. You can't say pain is always bad. The first thing he says is masochism. And he says masochists enjoy pain, uh, and BDSM, all those things. Well, the definition of masochism is pleasure out of pain. So it's a pleasure disguised as pain. So you can't take that as a as a reference to deny that pain is bad. Secondly, masochists enjoy pain in a certain situation. No masochist would go and have get himself cancer or would enjoy cancer, or no no masochist would purposefully drink from a cup who has been drunk from by a person who has cold. So yeah, that's not valid. Then he confuses biological pain and physical pain. What he's trying to say is that you can't hang all your morality and base all your ethics on biological pain, and I assume what he means is on physical pain, because all pain is biological, whether it is mental, whether it is stress, worries, you know, physical pain, everything is biological. All are perceptions in your brain, so all is biological. So if you mean that you can't hang your morality or you can't base your ethics on physical pain alone, then that is fine. Antinatalism, when Benatar says that pain is bad, he means all forms of pain, all forms of suffering. It doesn't matter whether it is physical, mental, whatever. And he gives an example of some piece of art, say, and he says that if there's a piece of art which pleases some people, you can't base your ethics on that. Well, yeah, of course, yeah, I agree. And antinatalism is not basing ethics on a piece of pleasurable item or painful item. It is talking about pain, suffering in all forms, genuine pain. So that point also is of yours is completely invalid. Then the woman comes in, and she says that you can't measure suffering, and then she tries to, does the classical mistake of applying antinatalists values ideas to existing people, and she says that even if there is suffering, it is wrong to say that you should not exist. Antinatalism is not saying that existing people should stop existing, or antinatalist does not say that you should cease life because of suffering. Antinatalism is talking about bringing new people, not about existing people. Then she says that kids living in shitholes or people living in war zones are happy. So how can you say suffering is bad? And she also talks about adaptation. Now, this has nothing to do with asymmetry, uh, but it has to do with the optimism bias, and Benatar very elaborately and clearly speaks about that in chapter 3 of his book. At this point, I started to doubt, at this point in that video, started to doubt if they have actually read and understood that book, or have they just read the points and then started criticizing it. So again, it is becoming another case of criticizing antinatalism without understanding its arguments properly. But anyway, so she talks about that, and optimism bias is a clear rebuttal for that. Then she says that she agrees that she agrees with antinatalism sometimes, but what she notes is that she agrees with antinatalism only when she is depressed. And when she is not depressed, she does not agree with antinatalism. And from that, she concludes that antinatalism always comes from depressed minds. and it is not part of normal human psyche, and so antinatalism is wrong. Now, antinatalism is not dependent on your emotional states or mental states. So, if you have this phenomena going that you feel that antinatalism is right when you're depressed and otherwise you're not, otherwise you don't feel that it is right, then your antinatalism is wrong. You have not understood the antinatalist arguments because you are driven by your feelings, you're driven by emotions, you're driven by your mental state. That is not what antinatalism is. Antinatalism is talking logically, irrespective of your emotional states. So yeah, you can't base antinatalism based on your feelings and emotions. So definitely antinatalism is not dependent on you being depressed. Then the man talks about, he says that this is the evidence that because she is, she agrees with antinatalism when she is depressed, that is the evidence that antinatalism is invalid. Well, antinatalism is not, as I said, dependent on your mental states. So that is not an evidence, that is evidence to nothing. It has nothing to do with your emotional states. Then they come to the point of consent. And the argument here is that antinatalists say that because you can't have a consent to bring someone into existence, you can't take a consent before they have come into existence. It is a case of imposing life on someone without consent. And what this man says is that there is a concept of assumed consent. And the example he gives is of a married partner. And he says that if you know that partner for so many years and you want to have sex with them and they don't oppose in any sort, then you assume that they consent to the sex and you have sex with them. Now, there is the answer to this is in the conditions itself. You know the person, you know what sort of mechanism that person would use to oppose having sex. Either it would be physical or verbal, and you base your consent on the fact that that person is not using that mechanism. So, and that is why you assume that consent. You actually don't really assume that consent, you derive consent based on your empirical data. If you sedate your partner, even if you know your partner for 50 years, if you sedate your partner with some drug and then have sex, that is still technically a rape. It could be a marital rape or whatever, but it is a rape. So, if your partner is conscious and not opposing sex in whatever means he or she uses to oppose, then you derive the consent. You don't assume the consent. So, your example of assumed consent is completely wrong. It doesn't fit here. There is a concept of assumed consent though, and Benatar uses Dr. Shiffrin's arguments in his book, and the argument goes like this: that if there is an unconscious person who is trapped somewhere, and the only way to release him or only way to save his life is to amputate his arm or limb. Okay, if you don't do that, he's going to suffer and die. So in this case, it is okay to assume consent and amputate his arm and save his or her life. But if the same unconscious person is not trapped anywhere, but he is unconscious, and there is a way that if you amputate his arm, he's going to get $1 million, or he's going to get 20 IQ points, or he's going to get some supernatural powers. Then you can't assume consent in such case. The principle here is that you can assume consent in order to avoid a greater harm by doing lesser harm. But you can't assume consent in order to bestow greater benefit by doing a lesser harm. So that is what the concept of assumed consent is. And obviously, for bringing people into existence, you can't assume consent by this principle. And then he says that uh, in case of bringing people into existence, you can't have consent because they are not existent, they are not conscious. Consciousness is achieved when they come into existence, and so it's impossible to take consent, so you can assume consent. That is what his point is. Again, the example, Schifrin's example which I gave, the person was unconscious, it was impossible to take consent, and that is where the principle of assumed consent came in, and that was a principle. So your point is completely invalid again.